I'm Tom Woodward, and I teach at Trinity College of Florida, and I'm your host for the Princeton Chronicles. And it has been my privilege for the past 8 years to be a part of a Christian Faculty Forum lectureship held annually on the Princeton campus. This forum has involved bringing leading Christian intellectuals to the Princeton campus to present talks on a variety of topics. One of the topics covered was the problem of evil, and that was dealt with by a leading philosopher at Notre Dame University, Alvin Plantinga. We brought in Dr. Charles Thaxton, a leading chemist and philosopher of science, to deal with the origin of DNA. And one of the most popular of those lectures that took place over the past 8 years was the one presented by Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, a leading historian in the area of ancient Near East history. He teaches at the Miami University of Ohio in Oxford, Ohio, and it's our privilege to welcome him here to the studio. Thank you, Dr. Yamauchi, for joining us.
Thank you.
And tell us a little bit about your background, your academic background, and how you came to develop this talk called Easter, Hallucination, or History, and the area you're working in and the talk.
Yes. I teach in the area of ancient history, which covers the whole gamut from Near Eastern, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman history, as well as church history. I have a special interest also in biblical backgrounds, biblical languages, and I wrote this presentation originally as an article for Christianity Today.
Okay, and then now the article has been also presented, I understand, at quite a few universities.
At a number of universities,
Okay.
such as the ones you've mentioned, Yale, Princeton, Florida, and so forth.
Okay. Your area is ancient Near East history. Now, you got your Ph.D. in that area?
My Ph.D. was in a very special field called Mediterranean Studies, which covered both the Greek area and the Near Eastern area. This was at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, near Boston.
Okay. And I was reading in your resume, your curriculum vitae recently, that you have studied 22 languages. Now, that boggles my mind, but I noticed as I saw the list of these both modern and ancient languages listed such names as Linear A and Linear B. What are those two languages? I've never heard of them before.
Those are scripts that were used in Minoan Crete, and Linear B has been deciphered as an early Greek dialect in 1952. Linear A was deciphered by Cyrus Gordon, my teacher, as Semitic in 1962. Wow. Although some have not accepted that decipherment.
Okay. So now, many of the languages in these ancient cultures, 1,000, 2,000 years BC, were written in cuneiform, the little wedge form.
That's right.
Script. Do you read cuneiform?
Well, I've studied cuneiform, okay. Especially Akkadian, which is the type of Semitic language which was used by the Assyrians and the Babylonians.
Okay. Let's move over to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many people are talking about the recent controversy, and we don't have time to get into the details of how the scrolls have finally been published, but how would you gauge the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as, looking over the whole of archaeology as it relates to the historicity of the biblical record? Is it as important as people have said it is?
Well, certainly the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most important manuscript discoveries in Israel. These were discovered quite by accident in 1947, and among the 7 scrolls found in Cave 1 were 2 copies of the book of Isaiah. And these copies now of the Hebrew scriptures, all of which are represented except for the book of Esther, are in some cases hundreds of years older than the Masoretic texts, which dates to about AD 900.
Interesting. I was going to say I had an opportunity to not actually get to that part of the Near East, but I was with my wife in Corinth recently, and we understand that there's a pavement in the ancient city of Corinth which corroborates with the New Testament letter of Paul. I was wondering if you could just mention what that is.
That's a very interesting inscription. It's of an individual called Erastus, who's mentioned in the book of Acts and in Paul's letter to the Romans, which he wrote from Corinth. And it illustrates the fact that although most early believers were from a lower class, there were a few wealthy and influential individuals like Erastus, who was, we know, the treasurer of the city of Corinth.
Now, would you consider, as you look across the gamut, the whole, surveying the scene of ancient Near East studies, biblical archaeology, since you became a believer, you came to faith in Christ as a young person, I think in your teenage years, would you see that these years of study have tended to buttress or or strengthened, or have they at times threatened your faith? How do you survey that?
Well, I've had the privilege of studying ancient texts and ancient history and the backgrounds of the Bible, and they certainly have helped me to understand the issues and the problems more clearly. And certainly they have strengthened my faith in Christ, in God's revelation, in the Scriptures. Mm-hmm.
You, in your talk that we'll see in a few minutes here, the Easter hallucination or history, you mentioned that some modern scholars are now talking about the historical reality of the early eyewitness claims that the disciples had actually seen Jesus arise from the dead. Do you see a more openness in our present era as we near the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century? Do you see more of an openness to even look at these rather daring claims that they saw Jesus alive? Are there some pockets of scholarship, historical scholarship, that's really looking hard at this claim?
Well, that's difficult to generalize in a few minutes. Many biblical scholars are still influenced by the anti-supernatural views of rationalism, which discounts ahead of time any claims to supernatural events. There are some exceptions to this. One which I mentioned in my talk is that of a Jewish scholar named Pinchas Lapid, who views the Gospels as giving very credible evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
Yes, I was startled by his statement that he believed that Jesus was raised from the dead, although was not the Messiah. Yes. And of course, we'll be able to view that in a few minutes. Thank you for taking your time to join us and let me chat with you.
Well, thank you.
Now, there's a second school of thought that attempts to explain away faith in the resurrection as a psychological crutch or vision. The Latin word for, which gives us the word hallucination, means to wander in thought or to utter nonsense. The modern psychological concept of hallucinations is primarily subjective experiences that are consequences of mental processes, sometimes fulfilling a purpose in an individual's mental life. Now, David Strauss, the very famous German skeptic, did suggest that the disciples had hallucinations in the clear air of Galilee, which gave them a belief in the resurrection. He discounted most miracles and all things supernatural in the first place. Now, modern religions do sometimes employ hallucinations deliberately, but these are induced by deprivation of sleep and food, and this is hardly the case of the New Testament records. The appearances of Jesus on 10 occasions do not really conform to what we know about hallucinations. Even a Jewish author who tried to attempt to explain away the resurrection of Jesus, Hugh Schoenfield, who wrote a notorious book called The Passover Plot in 1966, concedes, quote, "We are not dealing in the Gospels with hallucinations, with psychic phenomena or survival in the spiritualist sense." He goes on to say, quote, "What emerges from the records is that various disciples did see somebody, a real living person. Their experiences were not subjective," end of quote. Now, he goes on to say, however, that the basis of the resurrection was not in the real resurrection of Jesus, but rather in the disciples mistakenly identifying an anonymous young man as Jesus. And they were so confused and then so convinced by this false evidence of resurrection that they went out and preached the gospel. This very implausible plot also included the giving of a drug to Jesus on the cross to simulate death. Unfortunately, Jesus received a spear in his side, and that caused the plot to miscarry. This rather ingenious and far-fetched plot, which was made into a movie which almost no one saw, was denounced even by Jewish scholars as being without any scintilla of evidence. Now, more remarkably, another more widely respected Jewish scholar has outraged some of his colleagues by proclaiming his faith in the resurrection of Jesus in a most remarkable book by Pinchas Lapid, L-A-P-I-D-E, published in 1983, called The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective. Professor Lapid has said this: when these peasant shepherds and fishermen who betrayed and denied their master and then failed him miserably suddenly could be changed overnight into a confident mission society, convinced of salvation and able to work with much more success after Easter than before Easter, then no vision or hallucination is sufficient to explain such a revolutionary transformation, end of quote. He says, thus, according to my opinion, the resurrection of Jesus belongs to the category of the truly real and effective occurrences, for without a fact of history, there is no act of true faith, end of quote. Now, you may ask, well, how can he, as a believing Jew, say that he believes in the resurrection of Jesus, but he does not believe that Jesus was the Messiah? Well, there's a simple explanation for that. As you well know, there are prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament, for example, in Isaiah, which promise that when the Messiah comes, he will establish a kingdom of peace and justice on earth. And that obviously has not happened. Now, Christians believe that Jesus Christ will come a second time and fulfill those promises. Now, part of the way in which we have been misled about what Jesus would do at his first coming comes from the very popular, well-known translation of the angelic message at Christmas, with which you're all familiar. According to the King James Version, we were promised, or the angels promised, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. And as Dr. Ems can testify, just returning from the Holy Land, there is no peace there. In fact, there is an ever-increasing cycle of violence with the Hebron massacre and so forth. Now, not to upset many of you who cherish the King James, that's a beautiful translation, but the text on which it was based, called the Textus Receptus, was based on some manuscripts that a scholar named Erasmus rather hastily gathered together from a city in Switzerland. And so it's not the very best text. Usually, textual differences do not change much of the meaning. In fact, we have so many Greek New Testament manuscripts now that we can be about 97 to 99% sure of the actual text. In this one case, however, there is an important difference of a single letter, and I'm writing about this in a forthcoming issue of Christianity Today. That is, the Greek word eudokia, which is translated goodwill, in the King James Greek text, does not have an S. But in the better manuscripts, it does have an S. And that changes it, for those of you who are familiar with rules of grammar, into a genitive case, modifying the word before it, which is the word men. And if you check the NIV or any other recent translation, you will see the difference that this makes. The angelic promise at the first coming of Christ was not for peace to all men and goodwill to all men, but rather for peace to men of God's goodwill. There is an interesting parallel in the Dead Sea Scrolls, b'nei ratzono in Hebrew. In other words, the peace was promised to those who would receive Jesus as the Messiah, who would believe in his resurrection, and as Tom pointed out, confess one's personal need of Christ as Savior. Now let me turn to the subject of the resurrection and history. The resurrection certainly is a unique event, and therefore some historians and theologians do not want to deal with it as historical. Historians can only offer probabilities and make a case for the probability of the resurrection. But I think there is very good textual evidence for this. The most important passage is in 1 Corinthians 15, and this is familiar to most of you, but let me read it for some of you who may not remember it. Paul says, from verse 3, For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Now, incidentally, James was a brother of Jesus who did not believe in Jesus' messiahship during his lifetime. So it may have been this appearance which converted him and which transformed him so that he became leader of the church in Jerusalem, as we see in Acts 15. Now, the importance of this particular passage is that it occurs in an epistle which not even the most radical New Testament critic questions. Now, New Testament critics like to question just about every book of the New Testament. But this is a book that no one has questioned. Not even Ferdinand Christian Bauer, a very notorious German critic of the Tübingen School. And we know also from Galatians, which is another text which is not questioned by critics, that Paul, after his conversion, went down to Jerusalem 3 years later and conferred with the apostles. Now, some New Testament liberal critics, like Rudolf Bultmann and many of his followers, including those who published a very sensational book called The Five Gospels recently, seem to believe that there were no eyewitnesses left in the early church, and that the church invented a lot of sayings of Jesus and manufactured evidence. Well, there are many people still alive in the 40-year interval, let's say when Jesus died, we believe about the year 33. And certainly by the time Paul was writing these letters, which was in the 50s, and we can date exactly the date of Paul's coming to Corinth, for example, because we have an inscription of the governor, Gallio, who tried him. What this means then is that Paul received this tradition from eyewitnesses. And of course, he himself was converted by the appearance of Jesus to him on the Damascus Road. And he can claim this long list of very impressive witnesses, including 500 people, most of whom are still alive. So this is very, very significant evidence indeed. One scholar, William Lilly, head of the Department of Biblical Studies at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, has said, quote, "What gives a special authority to the list as historical evidence is a reference to most of the 500 brethren being still alive. Such a statement in an admittedly genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago." Now, what about the evidence of the Gospels? This depends to a certain degree on when you date the Gospels. Conservative scholars have argued for early dates for the Gospels. Liberal scholars prefer later dates. And let me just briefly summarize the situation. All are agreed that the Gospel of John is later than the first three Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. Since the 19th century, many scholars believe that Mark was the earliest Gospel, and that Matthew and Luke were based on Mark, together with a common source, which is called by the German word Quelle, or abbreviated Q, about 200 verses of the sayings of Jesus. Now, if we look at the Gospel of Luke, we see that Luke wrote the book of Acts after he wrote the Gospel. And Acts ends with Paul still in prison. We know from Roman history that this was during the reign of Nero, and that a great fire occurred in Rome in the year 64. Most conservative scholars believe that Paul was released at the end of his imprisonment, his first imprisonment, and then was rearrested and killed sometime before Nero himself committed suicide in 68. Colin Hemer, a British scholar, has written a very important book on the book of Acts, called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, published in Germany in 1989, in which, following F.F. Bruce, he argues that the book of Acts is probably written around 62. This means that the Gospel of Luke was written before that, at the latest 61. And if we accept what is called the two-document hypothesis, then Luke was dependent on Mark, which must be even earlier. And Q is dated, of course, quite early. So we have the possibility of early datings. Now, liberal scholars take the prophecy of the dating of the prophecy about the siege of Jerusalem as a benchmark, because that occurred in the year 70. And for that reason, some of them want to place Luke after that and Matthew in the 80s. But scholars such as C.H. Dodd and others who have examined those prophecies agree that it is not as circumstantial as a description as what we get from Josephus after the event, and there's good reason for dating the three Gospels before the year 70. Now, what about the possibility that indeed these Gospels do report an empty tomb? Well, surprisingly, many German scholars who are usually critical and skeptical do agree that the tradition about the empty tomb is early and genuine and authentic. But the early tomb is not sufficient to explain belief in the resurrection of Jesus, because it presents a puzzle. It is possible to explain the empty tomb by some theories, none of which are really convincing, however. For example, a German scholar named Paulus said that Jesus didn't really die when he was on the cross, but he was taken to the tomb, and the tomb revived him, and then he went off, disappeared somewhere. But that hardly explains the believer's faith in the resurrection. Kersop Lake, an outstanding New Testament scholar, argued that there was an emendation in Mark 16:6. So the women came to an empty tomb, but it was the wrong tomb. And the people there said, this is not the right tomb there, that's the other tomb, where Jesus' body was still lying. But that's hardly plausible, because we know that the tomb was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a well-known man in Jerusalem. Now, if the tomb was indeed empty, could it be that someone stole it away? Tertullian, a famous and dynamic church father, reports a wild speculation that the gardener removed the body because he didn't want his lettuce trampled by all of the curious pilgrims. Now, could it have been the Jews? Well, certainly not, because if they had the body, they could have simply refuted the preaching of the resurrection by Peter and the other apostles. Could it have been the Romans? This is rather implausible. They were the ones who surrendered it to Joseph of Arimathea in the first place. Why would they want it back? Now, there are some who speculate that the Christians stole the body away. And this was already mentioned in the time of the 4th century. Eusebius responds to this in a rather sarcastic and satirical manner. He has the disciples saying to each other, let us band together to invent all the miracles and resurrection appearances, which we never saw, and let us carry the sham even to death. Why not die for nothing? Why dislike torture and whipping inflicted for no good reason? And even if we don't convince anybody, at least we'll have the satisfaction of drawing down on ourselves the punishment of our own deceit. End of quote. Now, the sayings of Jesus, recorded in the Gospels, that he predicted his death and resurrection are very important. And a very significant German study, published in 1986 by Hans Bayer, Jesus' Predictions of Vindication and Resurrection, do confirm that, again, these are authentic sayings of Jesus and need not be doubted. Now, the reason they're important is that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, he would have been demonstrated to be a false prophet. And we have examples of the Gnostic Menander, who claimed that his disciples remained ageless, and when they did not, his movement completely collapsed. Something certainly earth-shaking transformed the disciples. What could it have been? We believe that it must have been the resurrection of Jesus. This is the only possible plausible explanation that could explain how Jesus' skeptical brother James came to faith, as we've already mentioned, how Paul, a persecutor of the Christians, was so transformed, and many other things, including Peter's transformation from a disciple who denounced and disowned his own master. Now, it is indisputable that the church developed as an historical phenomenon. Even the most skeptical historian has to explain that. Well, there's no way that this movement could have grown, as the book of Acts indicates, from 3,000 then to 5,000, with Peter preaching the resurrection at Pentecost, if indeed the tomb was still filled with the body of Jesus. Elton Trueblood, a distinguished Quaker philosopher who taught at nearby Earlham College, has an autobiography in which he says, in my own life, quote, "I certainly began as a skeptic as far as the resurrection of Christ is concerned. I thought of the story as comparable to stories in Greek mythology, and accordingly carried my doubt to the point of denial. I knew, of course, that the early Christians believed that Christ rose, but I was aware of the fact that many people in the past have believed things that are manifestly untrue. The first real change in my conclusions came when I began to consider seriously a particular kind of evidence provided by the apostles, and not what they said, but what they became. When I was teaching at Rutgers University in New Jersey, I had the privilege of inviting to speak in the chapel a very distinguished British scholar, J. Norman Anderson. He was an expert on Islamic law. He was at that time teaching in Harvard Law School. Professor Anderson has written for InterVarsity about the resurrection, and he says something quite significant, and with this I'll close. He said, quote, "Easter is not primarily a comfort, but a challenge. Its message is either the supreme fact in history or else a gigantic hoax. Either it is infinitely more than a beautiful story, or else it is infinitely less. If it is true, then it is the supreme fact of history." Thank you very much.